Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is an interesting study of something described as Triphalia, or in much simpler terms, triple penises. There is an outbreak of whooping cough in America, and this is causing concern for good reason. There is a mysterious disease spreading in China, thankfully not airborne but instead tick-borne. IQ in high school could be related to your alcohol use much later in life. The Finnish government has decided to colour deer horns to make them much more obvious and hopefully avoid nighttime accidents, particularly during winter. An interesting article, let's say, from The Atlantic, which believes that Memelords should be re-educated, which, given what they are, it probably won't work. A series of items that demonstrate both the absolute failure to understand statistics and how to use them correctly. And finally, Google looks to be using nuclear power to, power its AI. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with a rather confronting, but not necessarily useful, but definitely informative infographic. It's based on World Health Organization data, and it's showing you the primary causes of death in the world, or at least the leading causes of death. As you can very quickly see, ischemic heart disease, so things like a heart attack or infarct, a stroke, so very much the same thing as a heart attack, just in the brain, and COVID-19 are the leading causes by far and away. In fact, you could say that COVID-19 and ischemic heart disease are running almost neck and neck. That's already pretty damn terrifying. But then you have things like falls and self-harm being more than half of what death from road injuries are, and there are all sorts of other issues here. The image by itself is, as said, rather confronting, but there are some problems with it. For example, they very definitively separate out cancers, so in this case you have stomach cancer, and you have colon and rectal cancer treated differently. Then you have trachea, bronchus and lung cancers, again treated differently. Which is odd that they didn't just bring them all together in one category, much the same way with breast cancer. Then again, given the sheer number that would equal, it would seemingly artificially inflate the cancer rate, but not necessarily so. It is very much true that cancer is responsible for a major cause of disease and death. In what is somewhat more bizarre, we have Triphalia, or more accurately a case study of Triphalia. This is a very rare condition and practically unreported before now, but it's a man with 3 penises. Now, having more than one is not necessarily unusual in nature. For example, some spiders and similar will have a second penis and they will literally throw it at their prospective partner and run away. A figurative and literal example of telling someone to go fuck themselves. In this instance though, it's very rare that a human would have more than one penis, let alone more than 2. The man died at the age of 78, and, he may not have even known that he had 3 penises, and it's for a very simple reason. The other 2 were within his pelvic area. That is, they had not yet descended outside of his body, and as such, were only identified during a post-mortem examination, which would have been very interesting for the examiner, seeing there going, what the hell is this? What is particularly odd about this study, other than the fact it's going to have every high school boy giggling themselves silly, is that the researchers are calling for a more standardized method of not only classifying having multiple penises, but that it may actually be far more common than is currently thought. So yeah, the penises. You can start laughing now. In more, at least, useful educational science news and medical news, we have the idea of nasal vaccines. So rather than having to basically hold the child still, let the nurse or doctor inject them with a vaccine and then hopefully bribe them with a lollipop afterwards, you instead try and drug them with a nasal spray. It sounds slightly more horrifying, but it's certainly easier than the whole issue around needles, phobias, and the general discomfort and somewhat traumatic childhood experience of being vaccinated. The idea though is rather simple, that is, the nasal passage does provide a very effective means of delivering vaccines. It does have a very solid linkage to the immune system. This means that rather than snorting cocaine, you can now hook kids on snorting vaccines. In order for it to work though, you need to find a way to deliver the correct antigens to the site where antibodies and hopefully things like macrophages can find what they're after and take them to antigen-presenting cells and then find their way to B cells to generate more antibodies and hopefully things like T cells. The idea sounds great, and it has sounded great for quite a while now. Nasal vaccines have been in development for a very long time, but it's only this year that we're beginning to see very early stage clinical trials. Fundamentally, phase 2 trials at best, that is, take a group of adults who are healthy, otherwise have absolutely no comorbidities, and give them a vaccine to see how they react. And then hopefully from that figure out how much vaccine in this format to give to people who actually need it, or who are naive to whatever you're trying to vaccinate them for. At the moment, there are only 2 vaccines that are being experimented with. However, what they're being experimented for is multiple conditions. This should in theory allow people to be protected against things. For example, a combination of COVID-19 and influenza. Of course, just because this is in a clinical trial doesn't mean it will proceed on to being approved, for a range of reasons. The first and biggest is that previous attempts at this have, kind of failed. There's been a lot of argument about whether or not it's anywhere near as good as a more typical or, let's say, conventional injection, form of vaccine anyway, and further to that, whether or not it's actually worth trying this approach versus those more conventional methods. There is a reason why, particularly, let's say, China and India are preferring this approach for things like COVID-19, and that's because they independently developed their own nasal sprays for vaccines, for COVID-19 in particular. But places like America and the West as a whole are looking at this more along the lines of, can we take advantage of the relatively faster response from the immune system by doing this for other diseases than just COVID-19? And in theory, it should work better this way. The problem is getting enough of an immunological response for it to work, and therein lies the biggest challenge and likely the biggest barrier for this going forwards. In other things that we can be dealing with, particularly when we talk about vaccines, a whooping cough, or whooping cough as it is, and the fact that it's, experiencing another outbreak in America, which is stupid, and not just because it's an outbreak of whooping cough, but we have a vaccine for it, and it shouldn't be spreading. In fact, this should be a nothing event because it should not occur. There is a safe, effective, and readily available vaccine, and people, because they're idiot anti-vaxxers, are not using it. This leads to whooping cough being able to take a place, set up a effectively reservoir of the disease, and from there spread. In the last year, the number of cases, 16,000, has quadrupled. Yeah, it's taken a single year for the number of instances for this to quadruple and killed at least 2 kids. Which, sure, they're children, they're a pain, but they shouldn't die in an avoidable manner. Sadly, much of the hesitancy to be vaccinated, or at least get kids vaccinated in this instance, is almost entirely traceable to anti-vaxxer conspiracy nutter crap, or issues around the COVID-19 vaccine and public confidence. In both cases, it's wrong, because, vaccines work, they're safe, and they're reliable, and the COVID-19 vaccine is no exception to that. But unfortunately, people are prone to, becoming concerned, especially when we talk about their kids. In related news, but in an entirely different continent this time, Australia has concerns about the increasing number of gastroenteritis cases. Fundamentally, severe food poisoning causing inflammation of your stomach and intestines. And yeah, this is arguably not as avoidable because, typically speaking, there's no vaccine to gastro, unfortunately. But what can be done to stop it is pretty much safe food handling practices. That is, don't pat your dog and then make dinner. Wash your hands first. Don't go to the toilet and then not wash your hands. Try not to facilitate the fecal-oral route in short. But of course, it's not necessarily avoidable, as things like, say, salmonella may be on chicken, and if you use the same chopping board for chicken as for, say, fruits and vegetables, without washing it, you have concerns there about cross-contamination. There are plenty of problems, but it is fundamentally something that should and could be avoided, but isn't. Something that seems to be utterly unavoidable is TikTok, and the way this cancerous social media application is doing dumb shit. One of the current trending topics is that cough medicine can help you get pregnant. In short, yes but no. The problem is this. Cough medicine will not help you get pregnant. It's not really the cough medicine itself that does that. And the reason it doesn't do that is that, well, it's really more that anything that has that effect will cause it. And what we're talking about here is changing the amount of mucus that's being generated. Theoretically, some cough medicine would help with things around mucus generation, and particularly heavy mucus production, which could theoretically interfere with sex, and particularly with the movement of sperm up the fallopian tube. But for most people who are having trouble with getting pregnant, the reality is likely that that's not the issue. There's likely to be other issues that are causing a fertility problem. For example, issues around a fertile egg taking home in the uterus, issues around the sperm being able to travel there regardless of the environmental conditions, and so on. So it's unlikely to have the kind of benefit that they're claiming. The other effects of taking cough medication, or similar medication, could theoretically contribute to an increased number of instances of sex, but that's not really the fact. That's not what it's talking about. They're claiming that there's a direct relationship, rather than getting semi-high on cough medicine and then getting horny. In far more terrifying news, we have more exciting mystery diseases coming out of China. This time it's a tick-borne disease, which is only slightly less terrifying than airborne diseases. Mostly because, well, at least airborne diseases tend to spread quickly enough we notice them. Tick-based diseases are less so. The symptoms of the disease are rather straightforward in some ways. That is, you start off feeling rather unwell. But then things get a bit worse with fever, headache, and then vomiting. And then finally things get so bad you wind up with multiple organ dysfunction. That's things like your kidneys not working properly, your liver not working properly, heart issues, and presumably if things get bad enough, eventually death. Now, it's thought that there is a virus responsible for this. The problem is, it's an unknown virus. But it is apparently related to the Crimean Congo hemorrhagic virus, which, yeah, that's not fun, because that's got a 30% fatality rate. And presuming that you're not part of that 30% who die, the other 70% have a pretty rough time. The challenge with this particular disease is simply that there's actually a fairly long incubation period of about 1 month in which the fever and similar will start to develop, meaning that you may no longer have the tick attached to you once it happens, which means you've been infected for a while, and that also means you have more trouble being treated for it, because it will take longer to clear out a virus that's spread throughout your entire body. Now, there is a sort of silver lining to this, and that is, as long as you're nowhere near a wetland, that is basically swamps, riverines, Florida Keys, things like that, you don't need to worry very much. But if you are, or if you spend a great deal of time in, say, fields and paddocks dealing with livestock, you probably should look at going to the doctor and just having it double checked, particularly if you're based in China, although the probability of that is incredibly low. In somewhat less useful news, we have what is basically fake or off-brand Ozempic being sold. Now, this isn't that surprising. Ozempic has become incredibly popular in America, and given its relative price for what it is, and the fact that a lot of insurers, in other words, scalpers in America, don't cover it, individuals have to pay out a lot of money every month for their medication to lose weight and manage diabetes in some cases. Now, in some instances, this can be fairly restrictive because it costs quite a bit, at between $800 to $1,000 a month. Obviously, if you're not on a good insurance plan or you're not covered at all, that's a lot of money to pay. And because of that, people are going to off-brand alternatives. And that's an issue because you don't know what you're getting necessarily. In some instances, sure, you might be getting Ozempic, You might even be getting Ozempic that's just been watered down, or you might, if you're really unlucky, be getting saline. And if you're incredibly unlucky again, you might be getting something that is a cocktail of whatever the manufacturers decided that day seems like a good idea. The challenge, especially with this last category of random cocktails, is that the nature of what you're being given, and particularly if you think it's going to be Ozempic, can lead to some serious complications. For example, if you're given some sort of stimulant, sadly not something as exciting as cocaine or meth, but certainly a stimulant that will increase your body's metabolic activity for a short time, you can end up losing a small amount of weight initially, and so it looks like you're getting what you're supposed to be getting. But you're not, and you won't maintain that weight loss either. You'll lose some weight, and you might be able to keep it off, but you won't continue to lose weight. However, your body will continue to be active, and this can lead to wear and tear in ways and places you don't want. For example, extremely high heart rates are a fairly common issue with many stimulants. And you have other issues again. There's also the relative risk of interacting with other drugs if you happen to be on any other medication, particularly if it's a dietary supplement that isn't Ozempic. You can wind up with some pretty nasty interactions and metabolic byproducts, or just byproducts in general, being generated if the drugs interact. And that can lead to, well, a far more expensive medical bill than if you just paid the $800 to $1,000 for Ozempic in the first place. The largest and arguably biggest concern with this is that because all of these are injectable drugs, the problem is that if you aren't following very careful sanitation protocols, ensuring that you have absolute sterility in everything you do, there is a high risk that you could well be injecting all kinds of pathogens into your body. And, well, you have bypassed the first and biggest protective barrier that you have by your immune system, your skin, thereby injecting a fairly large amount of whatever's nasty into you. Of course, there's also a lack of regulation around the industries because of how they operate. That is, often they will sell it as something like research purposes only, not for human use, and other taglines that are never actually followed up on or even remotely considered, other than being a necessary disclaimer. They're kind of like those YouTube videos that have at the start, "This is for entertainment purposes only," or "We don't own the copyright," or yada 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 yada. So no, this is actually a rather worrying development in some respects. Admittedly, if you're getting Ozempic and you're actually getting Ozempic and not just thinking you are, well, it may not be a big problem. On the other hand, if you're not getting Ozempic, it could be a very big problem. Next, we have a relationship between your IQ as a teenager and what you're going to be drinking, or at least how much you're going to be drinking, much later in life. Now, the study we're going to talk about has some pretty big caveats to it, and mostly the fact that it isn't a very universal study. So without the diversity, which it's a pain in the ass to include that term, but of the cohort, let's say, you can't necessarily extrapolate this out to everybody else. So for now, assume that this only really applies to white men and women in the USA. For now, anyway. Generally speaking, the higher your IQ is in high school, the more likely you are to be consuming alcohol as an adult. This by itself actually shouldn't be that surprising. The first and simplest reason is alcohol is expensive. Yeah. Typically, the higher your IQ, the more likely you are to go into a role that gets you more money, or at least more money for the work you do, therefore you can pay to drink more. It's straightforward. Conversely, lower IQ, generally lower paying jobs, therefore you can less afford to buy alcohol. It's a pretty straightforward relationship, and one that arguably is an example of them putting the cart before the horse. Nonetheless, there are other possibilities as well. For example, a use of cannabis varies drastically across the age and socioeconomic demographics in America. Same with other drugs, so this may only be one variable to consider, and certainly it's only one aspect in and of itself because the study doesn't really look at other confounding factors. We can only hope that as your IQ goes up and the chances of you becoming a heavier drinker, you're not wasting a good scotch or similar, and instead you're drinking piss in a can. You Americans call this kind of beer Budweiser. In somewhat related news, we have mathematics, or more accurately, Irish mathematics, which possibly involves drinking as well, given the Irish reputation, although that's more of a stereotype, but then again, mathematicians and mathematics tend to be quite stressed, so who knows. Where this story is interesting, or at least news item is interesting, is how a Irish mathematician called William Hamilton had an epiphany walking along a bridge. Now this was in 1843, so the bridge itself is rather old, and it led to a surprising, let's say, a bit of graffiti being put on the bridge. The graffiti is in fact a rather large plaque that speaks to exactly what happened. Originally, it was a carving made with a penknife that looks very boring. It's I squared equals j squared equals k squared equals -1. Which, okay, what does that even mean? And what it means is that it's a way of, how to put this, describing the relationship between 3 different dimensions in space, which may not seem all that interesting or useful, but given it has a role to play in things like MRIs, wind turbines, programmings, satellites, all manner of things, it's actually quite important for something that may just look like a piece of graffiti done by an idiotic high school child. Of course, like a lot of mathematicians, the Irishman in question didn't actually survive to see his work used. Which, yeah, it's kind of hard today, let alone in the 1800s, to not only get your mathematical idea proved, but accepted by the wider community. Shifting to the environment, we have Finland. And other than the fact it's full of fins, it's also now full of reindeer whose antlers have been covered with reflective paint, looking like they belong in Fallout. This, again, sounds like it should be some sort of weird AI scam image or some sort of doctored image, but no. The image we're showing you certainly is, yes, but the idea is not. The reason for it is very simple. There are a lot of deer in Finland, and unfortunately those deer are liable to cause plenty of accidents, especially on or near roads. So to make them far more visible, well, make them colourful, but making them colourful by itself doesn't work so well. After all, if you just painted a giant orange spot on the deer, well, at night time it wouldn't do anything. This is where the reflective paint on their horns of a kind, their antlers, comes into play. Partly the fact that, well, they grow each year, and whilst yes, every year they do get somewhat bigger, they're also very pronounced, and they're near its head, so you can more easily see where the deer is. Now, the image we're showing you, as said, is a fake, but as much as the viral post may seem like it's a stupid bit of social media clout, it does accurately represent what's being tried to achieve. Well, trying to achieve. Not necessarily what they have achieved. Of course, they could also save themselves a great deal of time and effort by simply importing deer from Chernobyl. At this point in time, surely they should be glowing. Next we have American education, and what is going to be a rather stunning indictment of it, more so than anything else we've seen to date. It's generally accepted that the American education system is broken, and broken to an exceptional degree, but it's always been thought that there are at least minimum standards. Unfortunately, at least in one state, in this case, we have Oregon dropping even those minimum standards. Students will no longer need to be able to prove that they can at least reasonably read, write, or complete math, so they've dropped any of their R requirements, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now, this isn't a problem for this year at least. By the current student cohort's graduation, it probably won't be a concern either. It's going to be a problem at the graduating class of 2029, where after a stupid unanimous vote, and somehow a gross failure by that committee, the requirement to graduate will be dropped entirely. Not only is this a dumb idea because, well, the students have to be able to at least demonstrate that they have learned something rather than just being present in the class to get their diploma. But more than that, it means anyone in Oregon who has graduated high school there will be considered an inferior applicant because their graduating certificate means far less. It no longer indicates that they have even rudimentary basic skills in reading, writing, and arithmetic. All it means was that they were present at a high school. and that's really not going to help Oregon at all. Oregon's not really helped by much anyway, other than meth, but that's a separate issue. Now, as much as we want to poke fun at Oregon for this, they have at least presented a justification for their decision, but it's arguably generated by the same students who can neither read, write, nor do arithmetic, given that they're arguing that historical groups that have been disadvantaged in the standardized tests they were using are the ones who are going to be allowed to pass now. Which seems like an odd decision. If the hurdle was something students couldn't pass, it would be on the education department to be able to support those students in getting through those hurdles. Not simply remove the hurdle entirely. It's entirely possible that the same students have travelled to the UK, where they're now taking part in administering new laws that don't allow for eggs and flour to be sold to children or young people under 18, both in the lead up to Halloween and various other events, particularly Bonfire Night. The reason for this is that the police think that preventing students from being able to buy eggs and flour from particular supermarkets will prevent them from causing mischief. Yeah, it's a dumb idea. If people, particularly children, aren't allowed to buy something they particularly want, they will find other ways to source it, whether it's legal or illegal ways. So this won't really help with the antisocial behaviour, or at least not the end number of antisocial behaviours in statistics. What they'll instead find is that there's an increase in theft, rather than just an increase in the number of cars that are being egged and flour thrown on them. Of course, since this ban, let's say, only applies between the 28th of October and the 1st of November, well, anyone with a brain is going to go and buy what they want before this date, or, as mentioned, find other ways to source it. Those same children, at least according to The Atlantic, might well find themselves sent to re-education camps, as The Atlantic believes that, well, it's appropriate to send Memelords to re-education camps, given that America is turning dark and in the middle of a misinformation crisis. If a meme was enough to get you sent to a re-education camp, the world has gone to a very bad place. But it possibly has. But then again, it's The Atlantic. The Atlantic has proven itself to be less than ideal over the last few years, as it's fallen further and further into the dumb side of the bell curve. In this case, the whole idea that a meme hurt your feelings and therefore you should be re-educated shows that they really don't understand the whole idea of what a meme is. And particularly how, well, some kids particularly are an edgelord. In other items that are related to not understanding, we have a series of items related to statistics. Now, they cover a variety of different problems. The first relates to divorce, but specifically, which particular demographic is most likely to get divorced? And it turns out that it's likely to be lesbian couples. Yeah, it's weird. The current rate for heterosexual couples to divorce is somewhere between 16 and 19%. So let's round it up to a nice even 20% and say 1 in 5. Lesbian marriages are likely to be somewhere closer to 34%, so round it down to 33% and make it easy to say 1 in 3. So that's a pretty big margin between the two. 1 in 3 versus 1 in 5. Of course, this isn't particularly useful, and it's not useful for a few reasons. And the first is, well, quite simply that we haven't a standardized figure compared between the two. That is, the sheer number of same-sex or heterosexual couples is significantly higher, in fact, massively higher, than there are lesbian couples. As such, what could be a 34% could actually be significantly less once you start standardizing. And that's where a lot of these statistics don't really work out very well. They simply give you a percentage ignoring all other variables that need to be looked at. And you're not really comparing an apples-to-apples scenario when you do this. And admittedly, it is not the only example of it this week. The next we have for you is, well, divorce in general terms, but it related to differences in income, particularly monthly income, and the likelihood of divorcing, but what it looked at was male versus female. In this instance, it found that the probability of divorcing significantly went down as a male earned more each month. Now, as a female earned more, it did go down, but at a much slower rate. This sounds like it's fairly simple. That is, men apparently aren't marrying gold diggers. The problem isn't that. The problem is that we don't know enough just based on one image alone. This is not enough to say anything, particularly given we don't know if the differences are statistically significant. More than that, we don't know anything about the sample size, the socioeconomics, education, longevity of marriage, age. There are all sorts of other variables, and it's why a simple line graph like this isn't all that much help. It doesn't lead to much of anything. It's an interesting talking point, obviously, from this video, but it's not actually helpful. For this kind of analyses, you need to do multivariate analysis because just saying rate of divorce and income isn't enough. The two aren't necessarily related. And in fact, the next news item kind of says the same thing and perhaps brings together the last two news items quite well. It's a Daily Mail article that argued that a comfortable percentage of Gen Z think Hitler had some good ideas. Which, as we commented on X, yeah, he did. For example, he had Hugo Boss design the SS outfit. Sure, it's made an iconic uniform, in all kinds of bad ways, but it has become iconic. To be clear, he had some bad ideas and some plain barbaric ideas, such as genocide, but that's not the point. The problem with this is that saying he had some good ideas is not really helpful. You could ask anybody, is something a good idea? And no matter how dumb the idea is, somebody will always say yes. And there's actually a problem with this, and it's a well-known problem when we talk about surveys. But let's assume that they aren't suffering from that particular problem. Well, the first issue is this. The survey looked at 1,000 people, which is already a fairly small sample size for what they're trying to do. The second issue is that Gen Z is between 18 and 29 according to this, but Gen Z in this case doesn't make up a very large percentage of the total cohort that answered their question. In fact, we have a problem with this claim because they say 1/5, that is 21% of the respondents who are in Gen Z, but they don't tell us how many of the respondents are in that age bracket. That means if we just work on the very rough approximation, that 11% of all respondents said this, and there's 1,000 of them to start with, 110 people said yes. And if we assume that 21% of this 110 people said so, that means we have roughly 20 to 22 people who say, yes, Hitler had some good ideas, out of 1,000. That's hovering around the 2% figure, if not less. Given we've had to be somewhat, generous in our assumptions. And as such, less than 2% of people think Hitler had good ideas, which, well, the 2% of people could just as easily be trolls. This does bring us to the next item that's also statistics related, but it's a test from a website that is intended to figure out whether or not you have, too high standards, to be blunt. But it's because people both misunderstand what it is, and it's also not doing what they think it is. It's basically both sides of the argument are thinking the wrong thing. For example, the, response here shows that the individual basically assumes that this is meant to be a proper statistical analysis of what is the probability of pulling out a person with your particular standards, which, yeah, okay, that is what it's supposed to do, but the issue here is very simple. It's not assuming independence of variables. It's assuming that if you take all of these things together in one go, you will get it. And, well, beyond the fact that that's not what it's trying to do, it doesn't really work that way either. On the other hand, people who are using this are trying to make the point of, well, you're after all these things and they're all going to be packaged together, which it's also not really able to do. All it can do is tell you, based on the X percentage of population who has this criteria, and we multiply it by this other X percentage, and then this other X percentage, this is how many are left who have these exact things you want. It doesn't really work, and for a lot of good reason. Nonetheless, if, and there's a massive if to this, you were trying to do that, you wouldn't really get the kind of score they give you in the end anyway. For example, the less than 1% probability of finding an individual. Instead, it would only be able to say that this is the probability and give you a p-value, which won't translate anywhere near as well and be nowhere near as entertaining. Next we have news that's at least much easier to get, and that is all about cybersecurity, and the fact that hackers and the general pressure in cybersecurity sectors is leading to greater and greater burnout. Which isn't that surprising. When you're the one responsible for ensuring that your business continues to work as intended, and you have employees in your business who continue to use the same password for everything, yeah, they're going to burn out very quickly. And it's why more than 90% are citing overwhelming stress as the key driver to leaving their role, or at least the intention to leave their role. Your primary security officer in terms of cybersecurity has a lot on their plate. And not just do they need to ensure that everybody's doing what they're meant to be doing, that they're not busy watching porn at work when they should be instead crunching away at spreadsheets, responding to emails, or scrolling through Instagram or similar. The issue is that once people start doing that, they open up vulnerabilities elsewhere. But if they're not working on that aspect of it, they're working on figuring out how they can prevent you from doing something stupid like that. If things go really badly, they try to figure out how to recover from you doing something really dumb like that. But the human factor is increasingly not the biggest challenge. Most systems are pretty well set up now to deal with things like phishing emails and can reasonably effectively remove most of those problems. The problem is all the other technologies come into play that make it much easier to create trouble. Not necessarily problems that will break a business or cause it to stop operating, but they'll cause enough trouble for the cybersecurity department that they need to deal with it, even if they're not sure how to yet because of what it is, or in some instances where dealing with it is actually quite difficult and requires a lot of time, effort, and resources. And the final news item we have for you, we have also related to cyber development, but how do you power them? And, well, Google's decided it wants to go nuclear. Now, sadly, we're not going to see any particular accidents, as it seems like Google's decided to go and sign a deal with a small nuclear reactor to basically power their artificial intelligence systems, which is similar to what Microsoft has done with trying to power its systems as well, where they wanted to use 3 Mile Island. The reason for this is exactly what you would think. Most AI is incredibly energy hungry. It is like, well, it's very much like Chrome with RAM, except, well, in this case it's AI and nuclear power. And because of that, it's cheaper for them to have their own nuclear power plant than it is to try and buy power from the grid, which tells you just how much power they're using. It's kind of ridiculous. Now, sure, you could argue that renewables and so on would be better, but, well, not really. In this case, AI actually has an advantage, particularly when we're talking about something like nuclear power, where if, for instance, a area that needs electricity needs a sudden increase, so for example there's a surge demand for whatever reason, they're able to either shut down or slow down their processing, thereby freeing up electricity that can then get put into the grid for general population usage. Now if you use renewables, that's not the case. You're really stuck with what can be made at any given time. This is one reason why nuclear power is actually quite useful. It basically provides the generator with a constant source of income, but also flexibility to decrease usage in one area to supply into another area, theoretically at, well, arguably a greater profit, but more importantly with a more stable energy supply. Now, given how nuclear has a somewhat questionable reputation in some aspects of the world, you might think, is it safe? And, well, it's Google, and it's nuclear power. It's probably not safe as such, but we're not likely to see the core meltdown and have a nuclear disaster. We'll have other kinds of disasters instead. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.